It was mid-February 2019 when I first heard word of a serious virus spreading through the world. I put the entire Data Skeptic team on a temporary work-from-home schedule that turned permanent a few months later when we gave up our office lease. Oh yeah, this season, we're calling it Physically Distributed. The pandemic and its demand for people to work remotely was such a major stair-step change that a generation of researchers will be annotating this on their time series plots, explaining away a large change in the data generative process with the simple footnote reading, COVID-19. The supply chain game has changed forever, as has education, and it's quite likely your industry or field has evolved a more physically distributed approach to its human capital. This season is an exploration of the data and practices for remote education, remote collaboration, and an overall more distributed, sometimes asynchronous way in which people are finding success working together without physical proximity. There are now 2 years of longitudinal data to be studied. Surely researchers have interesting insights about this change, if we call it that, in how we work. I spend most of my time writing code, and I benefit greatly from the online communities I was already a part of for learning things or getting advice. It seems those places are going to be even more vital to me now that there's less water cooler talk about how to fix this or that exception. So that's where we're starting this season. I connected with Danae Ford Robinson, who's going to share her research in the human-computer interaction field, specifically around these digital online communities.
Hi, I'm Danae Ford Robinson, a senior researcher at Microsoft Research and an affiliate assistant professor at the University of Washington. I study software engineering and human-computer interaction, mostly focusing on online programming communities or where developers or technologists share their identity and their technical knowledge.
The intersection of HCL and software engineering is super interesting to me. For listeners that don't know the space well, could you share what are some of the outcomes or research questions or areas that you look into?
At the intersection of HCI, which is human-computer interaction, and software engineering, I'm mostly focusing on how people engage in software engineering systems. Mostly how developers, or programmers as I like to call them, because everyone may not consider themselves a software developer, are building systems, understanding how their identity is deployed in these systems, how does that impact how they work, how they wayfind. So a lot of how humans use technological systems.
So when I'm on a larger software team, I might find myself in a couple such systems, source control like GitHub, maybe I'm on Slack or Teams, I'm in a ticketing tool like Jira and Discord. My identity seems kind of smeared across all of these digital spaces. How do you look at it?
Yeah, smeared is an interesting word to describe it. So what I'm mostly looking at previously to the study that we're talking about today is looking at how developers across the gender spectrum, the racial spectrum, the geographic distribution, how they engage in online communities such as Stack Overflow and GitHub. So Stack Overflow is particularly interesting because it is a platform that immersion developers or even expert developers from across experience levels ask questions, answer questions, and give their knowledge to help others. So that's what's really interesting there is how people can be vulnerable in ways that they ask questions and also be helpful in ways they support others. So people helping others is really interesting to me. I find that thread is common throughout all of my research. I also work in other open source communities. You mentioned version control. So I study how software developers and emerging programmers engage in open source software, where developers can build systems that can be deployed and anyone can collaborate on them together and also evolve them over time.
Well, I have personally benefited so much from Stack Overflow in my life. Most of the time from questions somebody already asked, but several times from questions I got to pose. Are there any trends you've observed or insights in the engagement? Are there groups that are not engaging as much on average that maybe need encouragement, or what do the general statistics tell you?
A long time ago, I think when Stat My Advisor kind of threw out there, it was about on Stack Overflow, about 65% of the people answer 5% of the questions. So it was a small, this is like pre-2010, but this is a small population of people who are answering questions on the platform. So experts, users who are engaging there. From the annual Stack Overflow developer survey that they've been launching for a couple of years, they're seeing a range between 5.8 and I think last time was below 9% engaging of women on these platforms, which is also kind of disturbing because when we see in offline settings and software developers, women mostly make up about 18 to 20% of the settings. So it's really interesting to see that on the internet where you can be anyone, you're also still seeing a decline in the gender distribution of who's engaging in these platforms.
Yeah, it's like you're double underrepresented. First of all in the profession and then even more so online. It's strange.
And the point that is really interesting there is that when you're engaging in these platforms like Stack Overflow, you're seeking help. You're using Stack Overflow as a resource. Well, if you're not using the main popular resource that majority of the developer community is using, then where are you going for help? How are you getting unstuck? What resources are you using to stay within this field of software development? So there's a lot of broader questions there about the tools people can use, the resources people feel comfortable using to maintain their career in software development.
If there were an easy fix-all, like, we just need to make the font larger, we would have figured this out by now. It's obviously a complex issue. How does one approach it from a scholarly research point of view?
One way that I've actually been able to investigate this platform, so I've done some research investigating how the barriers, what are the barriers that people have to engage on this platform? Started off looking at women and identified about 14 barriers. And then from there, identifying that these barriers that we identified for women had a broader impact, as in they also impacted men and people across the gender spectrum. Turns out they also impacted novices, right? So a lot of these marginalized groups in these platforms have had challenges engaging, but it's interesting to see that it's not just the marginalized people who are impacted here. I think the most interesting part about this is that using that set of 14 barriers as a framework, we've been able to understand how you can flip the bit of each barrier. So something that was negative, figuring out how to improve them by figuring out how to reframe this fear of failure, for example, or this fear of understanding how to engage in a large community. How do you make the community feel smaller? And we use techniques like a online mentorship program. So Stack Overflow's first mentorship program, I was collaborating with them on that to figure out how to increase novice participation. And what we ended up seeing is that we were able to increase the score of novices who participated in this program by 50% on average. So I should also take time to explain what the mentorship program looked like. So on the Stack Overflow platform, we were able to take advantage of their chat feature. So if you go to stackoverflow.com and you see that there's sub chats for each type of programming language, topics that developers can just spin up, and they're essentially chat rooms, synchronous chat rooms. We use those instances or 4 instances of those to figure out how we can get expert users and novices in the same room to guide each other, to help them craft better questions so that they can feel like they're getting more out of the platform. So I think that there's a value there in understanding how sub-communities or creating safe spaces or helping people understand how to maximize the value of communities can also help them feel more comfortable being members of the software development community at large, but also wanting to give back later on as other mentors.
Well, it sounds like a great program and pretty impactful then if that's improved their scores by 50%. Do you know what any next steps are there? Are there ways to grow it?
So the next step that I've been really considering now is figuring out how it looks like on other platforms, like GitHub, for example, which actually had a large growth, since they had GitHub Discussions, which is something that is another version of a asynchronous chat that was launched about maybe a year and a half ago, where on GitHub Discussions, you can ask questions and anyone can ask questions, which is separate from issues, but it's really geared at how do you help onboard people to communities? How do you create a space where people can ask the quote unquote silly questions that may not belong in issues because it's not a bug, but it's really about how do I engage in this community? Where are the contributing guidelines? How do I get best in contact with a maintainer? Figuring out where those types of conversations are happening and allowing them to be more accessible to the first time contributor.
Good advice all around. Well, these communities have existed for a while. I've benefited from things like GitHub and Stack Overflow for, I want to say at least a decade now, which means we have a longitudinal data set that covers both before and after the natural experiment we've all been a part of with the oncoming of the pandemic and the switch to remote work. I was very happy to find the survey and many of your other papers and work in this area. But starting from that point, I was wondering if we could dig into a tale of two cities, software developers working from home during the COVID COVID-19 pandemic, a topic I'm sure many listeners are firsthand familiar with, so we all bring our own experience to the table to color it, but it's interesting to see it in survey form and learn a little bit more about some of the trends. Before we get into those, could you tell me a little bit about what the goals were? What did you want to learn when you set out to do this study?
So pre-COVID, so before January of 2020, even before December, a couple of my collaborators and I were investigating how remote work, or again, engaging in online communities, can really be a gateway for software developers. So specifically, we were looking at how remote work can be an advantage for trans developers and figuring out how they could foster communities that empower them to find flexibility of economically stable work. Find that being a software developer remotely can also give them autonomy to disengage and re-engage and also have control over their identity. I want to also set the stage for this pre-COVID remote work because there has been an incline in the amount of programmers who were able to work from home before the pandemic versus other careers like in art, design, and media, personal care, and business finance. So I'm going to set the stage that software development has already been in this globally distributed format, especially when you think of how people contribute to open source, where people are collaborating across time zones. There are people who have been contributing or team members who have never met each other in person. So I think developers are a great case study for understanding how and what remote work or hybrid work can look like successfully before the pandemic and give us a nice template for what we can look for after the pandemic. So going back to the Tale of Two Cities paper, the goal was to really understand what are some of the challenges, the benefits, and even some of the improvements, room for improvement that developers have had during the pandemic. But I also want to set the stage that remote work is not the same as pandemic work, right? There are several other factors at play. For the most part to date, before March 2020, we've been talking about remote work as this own separate entity of like you have work siloed and everything else is kind of does not impact that. Pandemic work is not that. Pandemic work is people are working remotely. They're also managing their families at home, their well-being, the well-being of their family, the environment. In previous remote work settings, people were able to go to coffee shops, for example. You couldn't do that in the pandemic. Your physical work setting looked a lot different and it impacted a lot of how you worked. So through the Tale of Two Cities paper, we wanted to gain a little bit more insight into what that looked like. What are the new benefits? What are the new challenges people are facing? And how have software engineers, their self-reported productivity, how has that changed since working from home?
Well, let's get into productivity first, maybe. That's the one I think a lot of developers get so central to because we have good metrics on our work, right? We really track what we do, and we want to feel like we're progressing and learning all the time. Was that possible for people during this, as you say, not just remote time, but remote plus pandemic time?
Yes. So I would say that overall, we've seen this dichotomy of experiences where for the productivity change, so we asked developers, compared to working in office, how has your productivity changed? This is what we asked them in our survey. And we're seeing this 30%, if you will, have felt more productive. About 30% have felt about the same, and 30% have felt less productive. So again, this time frame for the survey was about April to May of our second analysis in 2020. So this is quite a while ago. However, I have also read recent surveys that people have also seen that they felt a split still as well. So I think it's also interesting to note that a lot of the things that we found early in the pandemic have continued, and I wonder what they look like for hybrid work settings, but we can cover that later. So for the productivity changes, we've seen that some of the benefits that folks have mentioned as well are they feel like their health has improved and they get more sleep. They feel like they had more schedule flexibility and autonomy to determine what their schedule looked like. They also feel like they were able to get more heads down, focused work and have more control over their environment, as I mentioned, so their apartment feeling less dreary than the actual physical office, and also being able to spend many more moments with their family, children, and pets. Overall, we saw that all the benefits that we identified did have a positive delta on the productivity change. I could probably link the paper as well, but there's a cool figure, a chart in our paper that identifies the survey benefits with respect to productivity. And we saw things like this ability to spend less money, flexible hours, closer to family, there were significant differences there. I think it's important to acknowledge this as well because we did a separate analysis understanding the cost of benefits with less time, better focus time, like how much time they're spending on deeper work, but also their ability opportunity to have less distractions or interruptions. So the fact that working from home was able to, when people who did discuss that they had an increase in productivity, they also had better focus time. They also had less distractions and interruptions. On the opposing side, some of the same benefits for some were also challenges for others. So there were several participants who mentioned issues with connectivity and being able to not access like physical work devices if they were kind of remoting in. Also, the same opportunities people had with spending more time with family, children, and pets could also be quite a challenge, because if you needed to support and help your family or your child with their homework or their time to get them connected to their internet for their virtual learning, in addition to your time to get connected for your work, right? We also saw a significant amount of challenges with communication, figuring out a new set of communication standards and guidelines for how you were going to connect with your team and also other teams as well, because a lot of developers work across teams. Of the challenges that I like to acknowledge the most, there was a significant difference in missing social interaction. And we also seen this missing social interactions play a very important part in the team productivity as well, which is a second survey.
That breakdown you'd mentioned, that there's a split between people feeling more or the same and less productive. Obviously, the numbers may have evolved a little bit, but if you're the same, I guess you can't complain. If you're more productive, congratulations. But for that significant slice of people that found themselves less productive and maybe are still in that boat, have you learned any general attitudes or ideas about how to deal with that or make improvements?
Yes. So actually, we kind of came up with the set of recommendations and improvements that we've worked with Microsoft to kind of determine, and they have also evolved over time. One of the main ones is more of a charge to managers to really figure out how to best support their employees during this time. So creating settings and having designated time between meetings, for example, to have effective breaks. So there was a study that came out a couple of months ago from Microsoft where researchers were investigating how the science of breaks. So they conducted a study with about 14 participants from Microsoft and connected them to electroencephalograms, so EEGs, to be able to understand how their brains interacted between breaks between meetings. So breaks between meetings versus breaks outside of meetings, breaks without meetings. And they found that those who were able to have breaks between meetings, so that 5-minute gap that happens between, if you have a 25-minute meeting before your next one, you can start to see that there is a less heightened amount of stress that happens between. So you're able to transition better. You're able to kind of ease that stress rather than going back to back meetings where you have to pivot your mind quite a bit, pivot your brain activity to think of different tasks. And I can link that study as well.
Thanks to our annual sponsor, Weights and Biases, the developer-first ML platform. Weights and Biases is an enterprise-grade platform that gives you experiment tracking, dataset versioning, and model management. Their solution integrates with TensorFlow, sklearn, XGBoost, Hugging Face, and literally every other framework I could think of. Integrating with your model training process takes just a few lines of code, and there's even a nice live notebook on their site that'll show you how to get it going. Once your machine learning code base or notebook is wired up, you've just unlocked the next level of productivity. The Weights and Biases platform collects, aggregates, and beautifully displays all of your key metrics and telemetry so you can track your model training in real time and compare different runs. Have you ever had to screenshot a matplotlib graph that you drop in an email or in Slack to show your boss the results of your work? That's like serving a gourmet dinner in a cardboard box. With Weights and Biases, all of your collaborators can see the results of different runs with an idealized interactive suite of tools. You no longer have to be the single source of truth for your whole organization about how the model's doing. If you're on or leading a growing team of machine learning practitioners, you need to investigate if Weights and Biases is the right solution for you. Get started at w&b.me/dataskeptic and mention us when you request a demo. Thanks to our sponsor, Arctic Wolf, 2021 was a landmark year in cybersecurity. The rapid, piecemeal changes businesses made on the fly to infrastructure, applications, and access controls during 2020's huge shift to remote work were now under scrutiny, while security teams were still busy defending against a litany of attacks and attack methods. As the size, scope, and sophistication of attacks continued to grow, many organizations spent the last year overwhelmed by perpetual change, wondering when, where, and how things will ever improve. In early 2022, Arctic Wolf conducted a survey of over 300 global IT security decision makers to understand their priorities and anticipated challenges for the years ahead. Our goal was to understand their security roadmap for 2022 and to get a first-hand perspective on their current objectives and potential obstacles looming on the horizon. Visit arcticwolf.com/skeptic to find out what they learned. That's arcticwolf.com/skeptic. That's a nice insight then, and something that I almost wish we could just broadcast to all managers of the world, but there's no such channel. Could we approach it from a software point of view?
So at Microsoft, we have the Viva Insights teams, which is really centered around figuring out how to make people productive, not just software developers. How can you kind of give people small incentives to modify their calendar in order to create concrete boundaries of how people do this? So I mentioned this 5-minute between meetings. What we've seen a lot of, and this is actually from a Nature paper from the Microsoft Electronics and Devices team that they put out, they were looking at how people's calendars, regardless of role as a software engineer or not, and looking at the results from people pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, they were able to see that people were in more meetings longer. And there was another study that showed that there is actually another third peak of people meeting or having a lot more work to do after their 9 to 5. From these findings, they have been implementing this toggle you can add to your calendar where you can change the setting and set meetings to default to be 25 minutes, or the traditional 30-minute meeting to be 25 minutes, and then the traditional 1-hour meeting to be 50 minutes. So by default, when people create these blocks on your calendar or you create a meeting, it will default give you that 5-minute gap. Again, encourage people, gently nudging them to have that time for themselves, to recoup, to get up and get a glass of water, to get up and stand up and stretch for a little minute. Also, on Microsoft calendars, we have things like the focus time that is default setup. And I haven't used this myself, but several of my colleagues have, where from the Viva Insights team, it's able to extract what gaps you have in your calendar, aside from your meetings, and recommend to you that you set these up as focus times. So you have deep time to focus on what you want to work on rather than engaging deeply in meetings, which is also valuable, but is a different type of productivity that's happening.
You mentioned some communication challenges that came up as well. Could you expand on what you learned from the respondents?
The communication challenges we were seeing were essential for new employees coming into Microsoft. There was also a set of team collaborations of people who were already FTEs at part of Microsoft. For the new employees coming in, the communication challenge that they were having is, I'm new to this organization or new to this team. I'm not quite sure about the tone, the cadence, the communication style of people on the team. So there was a lot of that went unsaid, if you will. That is quite a challenge for people who are trying to get the ropes, really figure out how the team interacts. One solution that some have come up with is setting the set of communication standards or guidelines for their team. And that was one of our strong recommendations that we find from participants, but we also is a great recommendation for how to be effective in your hybrid settings. So in creating these communication standards, for example, you can define what your working hours will be. For example, like, as a team, are we going to accept that Wednesday afternoons are no meeting Wednesdays? So we shouldn't expect to hear fast responses from people on Wednesday afternoons. Versus, okay, well, Mondays are going to be from 9 to 12. We're going to expect more people to be available to answer synchronous questions on Teams, for example. Having those set of standards and expectations of what you as a team member would expect from other people, as well as what you're setting for yourself, gives each other a common language. It also allows the manager to understand what is the best way to interact with their employees and give their employees trust, give their ICs trust. Likewise, some of the other recommendations for improving team productivity along the communication side was managers holding weekly one-on-one meetings and keeping hold of their regular team meetings at whatever cadence made the most sense for their team. Because again, although we are working deeply, there's also the chance of that isolation that happens, that a team member can go off and work on something that they needed to touch base and they didn't have the opportunity to do that. So when you're having those regular team meetings, basically your scrums, for example, you're able to really connect back and see how the work that you're doing can impact others on your team, which was an example of a communication loss during the pandemic.
Earlier, we touched on those missing social interactions and maybe that managers could create settings for those to exist. Those will have to be done in some new digital way. And it's not that we don't have tools for that. We can obviously send bits back and forth to each other, but it still somehow doesn't, for many people, myself included, feel like it has parity to the real world. What's missing, and will we ever achieve that?
I can tell you a little bit what people have done before, and then maybe we need to figure out what that transition looks like for hybrid settings. So for before, some of the early recommendations we had was including social activities. So a lot of people were trying to figure out different ways to engage their team. However, a lot of people were doing those outside of their set working hours. So if you're working 9 to 5, they want to have the happy hour at 5. Well, if happy hour is at 5, I'm missing that important team bonding time. Well, I have to pick up my kids from daycare, which is daycare being my neighbor's house next door, right? That's the time I started interacting with my family. So by default, when we set some of those social activities outside of the work time, some people got excluded from that. So not only were they missing that from their core 9 to 5, they also missed out on the bonding time, which is essential to building that team rapport. So one of our core recommendations was including these social activities as part of work and also thinking beyond what this happy hour looks like. Happy hour is fun and all, but everyone doesn't drink, and there's other ways to actually have fun. There's different painting things you can do, right? There's the paint classes. There's the cooking classes on Airbnb, for example, which allow you to virtually travel to a place. The most exciting recommendation that we got from others was kind of having those social activities be a part of the core work time. And then actively, in doing so, you start to think about what are ways I can actively be inclusive to my team? What can I do to maintain team culture in a way that's open and receptive for everyone so everyone feel like they can be a part of the team? But now, thinking about what it looks like through hybrid settings, which is, I think, essentially your question, is a whole nother beast, if you will. Because in hybrid settings, some folks may be in office, physically in the facility, and then others may be remote. So what are our meeting rooms set up? How are they set up in order to allow us to do that effectively? So that everyone still has the voice. When we were all remote, everyone could raise their hand virtually to engage. What does that look like in-person, in-facility settings when also one person or 3 people are remote? I know there's been work at Microsoft looking at how we can incorporate that back into our hybrid meeting settings. And there's people like Sean Rintel and Abigail Sellen at Microsoft Research who are looking at that. However, the biggest hybrid encouragement people are giving is give each other grace as we figure this out, because it's not going to be an even split between who's remote and who's in person. So when we have these social activities as part of a work setting, maybe we should have, although people are in office, have them bring their laptops to the room, right? So they can also be able to have that, you see their face during meetings, and they can also feel like they're on a leveled or similar platform as others. Because everyone's going to have a different expectation of what hybrid looks like, and everyone's not going to have the same type of hybrid lifestyle as we may have appeared to have sometimes in the remote work setting. So we need to give each other grace in those cases.
Well, I've heard various reportings about stats on which companies are going back or going to be hybrid or what the future looks like. Do you have any sense, since you've been doing survey work and thinking from the user's perspective, what does, not that any worker's typical, but what does the typical worker want? Or are there trends you see there in people having a desire to go back and be hybrid, keep things the way they are, or whatever the case may be?
I would say that there is quite a mix. And this has actually been kind of highlighted in some of the hybrid work materials. So Microsoft, for example, will be moving to stage 6 quite soon. They announced that. I think that's been kind of highlighted in the news. What we've set up even before we arrived at stage 6 was a system, a framework for talking to your managers to figure out what does hybrid work look like on an individual basis. Because hybrid could be an hybrid worker who's working from home some days or working from the office in some. It could be a hybrid team where some people are permanently remote and some are physically in the facility. And that threshold of time looked different for everyone. So during the pandemic, workers were thankful for the flexibility. Right now, as folks move towards stage 6, which is starting to come back to office slightly, they are still seeking that flexibility. They've had that autonomy that has been really great for their morale and being a member of the team and figuring out what their new work setting looks like. They are trying to figure out what it looks like in the hybrid setting post-pandemic if we ever get to that full stage. So I would say that workers are looking for a flexibility that is dependent upon what works for them at the individual level. There is no one size fit all. And that's what researchers have found. There is no one size fit all for hybrid and flexible work environments for folks. It's going to be up to managers and their organizations to be able to be responsive and supportive of what that hybrid setting looks like for folks.
Well, if I were an employer looking at these and trying to make some decisions, one of the areas I'd zoom in on were those benefits you'd highlighted earlier. And even if I was Ebenezer Scrooge, only concerned with the bottom line, when I hear there's more deep work, I know that's good. When I hear the employees are healthier and getting more sleep, I know that's good. Maybe their flexibility in schedule doesn't suit me if I want these rigid meetings, but two pluses and a minus, it seems like there's an overall net positive here. Is there any guidance you would give to employers about how to better structure their organizations as they're thinking through these issues?
The best guidance I would give them is to, and maybe this is my call to action, is to conduct your own surveys with your employees because they'll tell you what they want. Figuring out how to best support them in hybrid settings, asking them how often they feel like they maybe want to come into the office, offering them opportunities to have hybrid settings. Because that was something that I think a lot of folks, and it's something we learned from open source communities who have been doing this hybrid remote work for a while now, right? Where there was a remote work set up that folks were empowered to use and take advantage of so that they could be effective at home or effective wherever they are working from. Organizations like GitHub and Stack Overflow, these companies that I mentioned earlier in the talk, their employees were already remote first, pre-pandemic. They already had different advantages of special cameras they used or a nice hybrid setting at home where they had a chair that was ergonomically sound. So what does that look like for the range of employees, a larger group of employees? And the only way to know that is to ask them. And I think that was one of the main advantages of our study and where we got so much great feedback from other survey respondents taking our survey. We're like, thank you for asking, right? They were like, we definitely got some one-off emails that were just like, I appreciate you all inquiring about this and sharing this up because at the time, not that many people had asked this specific question. And I think that employees would do the best work when they feel like they're heard and respected and they feel that they have a little bit more autonomy over their flexibility and that their employers care about that.
It seems so obvious now that you've said it to ask the employee what they want. Great advice indeed. Similarly, you had a follow-up survey. I'm looking now at the How Was Your Weekend? Software development teams working from home during COVID-19 paper. And I'd love to actually get towards the regression and the learnings there. But to start off, is there anything we should highlight about this survey in contrast to the previous?
Yeah, so this survey, the core findings that I will highlight is that we were really focused on how teams work together or how people feel like the pandemic may have changed or shifted their relationship with their team, how they collaborate. So we had some findings from our first survey, which is from our broader work from home. How are your productivity changes? How do you feel like you're meeting milestones? In our second survey, which is the How Was Your Weekend paper, we found that 74% of these respondents, again, missed the social interactions with their colleagues. 51% reported a decrease in their communication ease with colleagues as well. And then from our regression model, we found that the ability to brainstorm with colleagues, the difficulty in communication, and then also the satisfaction with those social activities were important factors to consider. So again, it was kind of interesting to see that the same factors we were identifying across were still persistent in thinking about how people collaborate when we started diving deeper into that.
And can we talk about some of the results from the regression and the analysis? What are some of the key factors that jump out from the data?
So first, I mentioned we had the 608 responses. We created this model that we looked at for all the team culture factors, which reduced to our final reduced model. And we were looking at what explained team productivity. So the factors that I want to highlight the most would be this idea of the less awareness of what colleagues are working on. And this kind of results from how folks are communicating within their team. So I mentioned a little bit earlier about if Bob went to a Scrum meeting but hasn't connected with the team for a whole week. They haven't come back to the manager, to the whole group to know that, oh, actually what you're working on has shifted quite a bit because they've been siloed, right? So there's been a really big challenge with people feeling siloed, not just like emotionally isolated, but their work not really being able to have the tie back to the latest project goals, expectations, and outcomes. You can consider this if we were in person. You're walking down the hall and you may have connected with someone from a team next door, and they're talking about how their project may have shifted a bit. That's that hallway water cooler conversation that keeps you also abreast of what's coming up down the pipeline and how your work can impact that. People were missing that. In order to schedule that on Teams, for example, you had to actually know who exactly was working on that on the other team, catch them at the right time, schedule a meeting, awkwardly come to this Teams call that was previously just like a walk past them in a hallway conversation. So it was a lot more friction was there that inhibited how people connected. So that's some of the friction that being remote did cause. Also, one of the other factors I want to highlight is this impactful contributions to the team. So as the individual, it's hard to know how impactful your work could have been to the broader goals of the group, because not only are you not able to have those side conversations with other group members where they're able to say, hey, that work you did was awesome. It really helped me understand how to do XYZ. There was no assessment. It was harder to assess how your small part of the project was able to help and really be a pivotal role to the broader goal. Some other factors that we were kind of having in my second group here were, again, the external team bonding activities, the ability to make decisions as a team, the start and end of meetings of non-work talk. So that beginning transition of meetings where you're asking people how their days are, or you talk about the latest show you were watching. Those kind of help the transition, and those little mini opportunities to build that team bonding were struggling. Those were challenges, or great examples of this difficulty communicating amongst each other.
Is there anything you can tease us from your current research or stuff that's coming down the pipe?
Pre-pandemic, as I mentioned a little bit, I was working a lot on who was engaging in open source communities, who was engaging on these online communities that programmers were asking for help, giving help, supporting one another. Lately, I've been thinking about how people trust these communities, how they find trust in different communities and the systems that they're using, and where they feel comfortable asking those tough questions. Lately, it's been questions about how different AI-assisted agents can be supporting developers. So I'm currently looking into projects that can help us understand and build metrics around what trust looks like in some of these systems, the same way people have been really skeptical or engaging in trust in how they ask general questions about linked lists and loops on Stack Overflow. But what does that look like, and what forms are people using to ask that about AI-assisted agents? So that's quite a little bit of a different tangent, but it fits into the broader work that I'm working on. Is what is the next generation of developer communities? Who is in the next generation of developer communities, and how they can be and continue to be a resource for others.
Where can listeners follow that work or anything else you're doing online?
So online, you can follow my research on my website, which is DanaeFord.me. Danae Ford being my pen name. All my research will be published under that name. I'm also on Twitter at Danae Ford Robin, and a lot of the research blogs will be posted on the Microsoft site. So I'm looking forward to getting connected with folks. If you're interested in any of the recent research projects I mentioned, I'm happy to stay in touch.
Danae, thank you so much for coming on Data Skeptic and sharing your work.
Thank you so much for having me.
That concludes another episode of Physically Distributed. Thanks to our sponsors, Weights and Biases, and Arctic Wolf. Myself, Claudia Armbruster, as Associate Producer, Vanessa Bly, Guest Coordinator, David Abembe, Show Notes, and our host, Kyle Polich.